10 July 1940. The English Channel. Somewhere above the white cliffs of Dover, a German pilot named Hauptmann Adolf Galland is climbing toward 20,000 feet when he sees them. Three silhouettes emerging from the haze, sun glinting off elliptical wings. Spitfires. His radio crackles with warnings from other pilots in his staffel, voices tightening with urgency. In that moment, Galland made a decision that would define the entire air war over Britain. He decided to talk about what he had just experienced. What he would see, over and over again, was not just an enemy aircraft. It was an adversary designed to break him and everything he had been trained to accomplish. It was British engineering set against German doctrine, and the British had made a machine that seemed impossibly to anticipate his every move. Within months, this fear would spread through the Luftwaffe with the certainty of an infection. German pilots would go to extraordinary lengths to avoid fighting these aircraft. They would volunteer for other duties. They would falsify mechanical problems. And those who could not escape would prepare themselves for a fate they believed was almost certain. But the truth about why British fighters struck such terror into German hearts is far more complex and fascinating than mere technological superiority. It is a story of choices made in peacetime, of engineers who understood something fundamental about the physics of flight that their German counterparts had not yet grasped, and of an aircraft that became something more than metal and petrol. It became a symbol of resistance itself. To understand the terror, we must first understand the world from which it came. For most of the 1930s, the Royal Air Force had believed that the future of air combat lay in speed and altitude. Climb higher than your enemy. Fly faster. Keep climbing until the enemy cannot follow. This philosophy, whilst sound in theory, had a fatal flaw when applied to actual combat. It assumed that air warfare would be fought in a clear, organized manner, with defined engagement zones and sufficient warning time. It assumed that the enemy would cooperate by flying in formations that could be intercepted neatly from above. The reality, as the battles over Spain and China had begun to demonstrate, was far messier. The Luftwaffe had discovered something different in their testing grounds in Spain between 1936 and 1939. They had learned that dogfighting required maneuverability at lower altitudes, that turning ability mattered more than raw speed in combat, and that the best fighter pilots were not those with the fastest aircraft, but those with the best tactical awareness. When the Luftwaffe began their campaign against Britain in the summer of 1940, they brought with them a machine that embodied these lessons perfectly. The Messerschmitt Bf 109E was the fastest fighter in operational service anywhere in the world. At 19,000 feet, it could push 354 miles per hour. In a dive, it was utterly devastating. It could outrun almost anything the British possessed, and it could execute the one maneuver that German pilots had been trained to use above all others, the high-speed dive attack. The German pilot would dive from above, guns blazing, and climb away before the British could respond. This was not supposed to fail. This tactic had been perfected in Spain. It had worked against Chinese aircraft. It had worked against Polish fighters. It had worked against everything the Luftwaffe had encountered. And then it did not work against the Spitfire. The Supermarine Spitfire had been designed by Reginald Mitchell, a man who had spent the better part of the 1930s racing seaplanes in the Schneider Trophy competition. Mitchell understood aerodynamics at a level that was, for his era, almost supernatural. He understood that every surface of an aircraft had a purpose, that efficiency and beauty were not separate concepts, but aspects of the same essential rightness. The Spitfire's elliptical wing was not merely beautiful. It was the solution to a problem that had plagued aircraft designers for decades. When aircraft turn, the outer wing loses lift, and the inner wing generates excess lift. This asymmetry causes a vicious rolling motion that pilots must constantly correct. Mitchell's wing solved this by distributing lift almost perfectly across its entire span. The result was an aircraft that could turn inside the Messerschmitt, that could hold a turn far longer than the German fighter, and that could do so without falling from the sky or spinning uncontrollably. In combat, this mattered infinitely. The Spitfire was manufactured primarily at the Supermarine factory in Woolston, near Southampton, with secondary production at the Castle Bromwich facility in Birmingham. By 1940, these facilities were producing roughly 100 aircraft per month, though by the war's end, this would increase dramatically. The aircraft weighed approximately 6,600 pounds empty, stretched 29 feet from nose to tail, and had a wingspan of just over 36 feet. Its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine produced 1,030 horsepower, driving a wooden propeller at ferocious speeds. In the hands of a skilled pilot, the Spitfire could reach 362 miles per hour at altitude, a fraction faster than the Bf-109E, but the crucial difference lay not in absolute speed, but in what the aircraft could do throughout its operating range. The Spitfire was faster in a turn. It was faster recovering from a dive. It could fight effectively from 5,000 feet to 25,000 feet, whereas the Bf-109E truly excelled only above 15,000 feet. The British had also equipped their fighters with the Browning 303 machine gun, a weapon that, whilst inferior in firepower to the German cannons, allowed for sustained bursts of fire that could shred an enemy aircraft if the British pilot could position himself correctly. By the autumn of 1940, German pilots had begun to realize that the standard dogfighting tactics that had served them so well elsewhere were not working against the Spitfire. The high-speed dive attack, the fundamental basis of Luftwaffe doctrine, would draw the British fighter into a climb-out maneuver. The Spitfire, with its superior climb rate and turning ability, would eventually claw its way onto the German's tail. Time and again, experienced German pilots reported the same thing. They would attack, the Spitfire would turn, and suddenly the roles would be reversed. The British pilot would be behind them, and a German fighter pilot at a disadvantage in a British fighter was almost invariably a dead German pilot. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. German pilots had been trained to believe in their superiority. They had accumulated victories over Poland, France, and the Low Countries. They had experienced the intoxicating sensation of air superiority. And then they came to Britain and found themselves matched against an aircraft that, in the hands of an equally skilled pilot, could do almost anything their own fighter could do, but better. There was another factor at work as well. The Hawker Hurricane, the other primary British fighter, was slower and less graceful than the Spitfire, but it was also more robust and, in some respects, more devastating in combat. Where the Spitfire was a knife, The Hurricane was a cudgel. It carried a heavier armament, could absorb more battle damage, and, crucially, had been designed by Sidney Cam with the philosophy that an aircraft which could be repaired and flown again tomorrow was more valuable than an aircraft which was fractionally faster, but unforgivable in combat. Production of Hurricanes occurred at the Hawker factory in Kingston and later at subcontractors across Britain and Canada. Between them, Spitfire and Hurricane production would eventually reach almost 1,000 aircraft per month. The availability of these numbers created a strategic reality that German planners could not ignore. The British were not only producing fighter aircraft at rates the German aircraft industry could not match, they were producing them in forms that were operationally superior in the skies above their own home. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. Now, back to the story. The German response was predictable, but ultimately ineffective. The Luftwaffe began to experiment with new tactics. They moved away from the tight formations of the Battle of France and adopted looser, more flexible combat formations known as the Schwarm. They began to focus on bomber protection rather than seeking dogfights with British fighters. And they began to develop new aircraft types specifically designed to counter the Spitfire. The Focke-Wulf W190, which arrived in 1941, was a genuine advance, and many German pilots would speak of it with genuine affection. But it came too late to alter the course of the battle, and it could never be available in sufficient numbers to replace the Bf-109. More importantly, by the time the W190 appeared, the British were already developing the Spitfire Make V, EII, and Make I, X each an improvement on its predecessor. The technological competition between the two nations never ceased, but the fundamental gap never closed. The British had the wind at their backs. The comparative statistics told the story with brutal clarity. In a turning fight at 15,000 feet, the Spitfire could turn with the Bf-109E and actually outturn it. The German fighter's rate of climb was superior above 20,000 feet, but this advantage became irrelevant if the engagement took place at medium altitude, where most fighting actually occurred. The Spitfire's service ceiling was 36,500 feet. The Bf-109E's was 34,750 feet. The British aircraft had superior visibility, a crucial advantage in a medium where seeing the enemy first was often the difference between victory and death. The BEU-109E carried two 20M cannons and two 303 machine guns, giving it impressive firepower, whilst the Spitfire carried 8 303 machine guns, a lighter armament, but sufficient in the hands of a pilot with good gunnery skills. The German fighter was faster in level flight at high altitude, where it could push 355 mph compared to the Spitfire's 343 mph. But this single advantage mattered little when the British pilot could simply turn inside the German formation and pick off stragglers. Moreover, the British had developed superior tactics for coordinating multiple aircraft, learning from the experience of the Spanish Civil War and applying those lessons with greater cohesion than their German counterparts. The records of Luftwaffe pilots capture the evolution of their thinking as the months turned into years. Early confidence gave way to respect, then to anxiety, and finally to something approaching fatalism. Pilots who had begun the Battle of Britain as confident young officers found themselves, by 1943, flying defensive patrols in the Reach itself, watching American bombers arrive with fighter escorts that were, if not individually superior, certainly numerous enough that numerical inferiority became the defining characteristic of the air battle. The Spitfire, by then available in multiple marks with increasingly powerful engines, had become as familiar to them as the sight of flake. It had become an adversary they understood and feared in equal measure. The American Mustang, when it finally arrived over Europe with drop tanks, allowing it to range across Germany itself, presented a new problem entirely. But before the Mustang came, before the Americans arrived in force, the British Spitfire had already achieved something that no other weapon system had managed. It had shown the Luftwaffe that their doctrine was flawed, that their aircraft was not invincible, and that defeat was possible. To a military organization that had known nothing but victory, this realization was devastating. The legacy of the Spitfire and Hurricane extends far beyond the years of the Second World War. The Spitfire, in particular, has become almost mythological in British culture and, increasingly, in the wider world's understanding of the conflict. There are several surviving examples in flyable condition maintained by the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight and private collectors. When a Spitfire takes to the air today, with its distinctive elliptical wings catching the sun and its Merlin engine producing that distinctive, high-pitched scream, it produces a visceral reaction in observers who understand, even without conscious thought, that they are watching history. The aircraft has appeared in virtually every major film or television drama depicting the Second World War's air campaigns. More significantly, it has become the symbol of British resistance itself. Not in a bombastic or propagandistic sense, but in a subtle way that speaks to the actual experience of the men who flew and fought in these aircraft. What makes this story remarkable is not merely that the British produced a superior fighter aircraft, though they did. Many nations have produced superior weaponry. The remarkable thing is that they did so whilst their nation was facing existential threat, whilst their aircraft industry was under constant bombardment, and whilst they lacked the vast industrial capacity of Germany or the resources of the United States. They did it because of choices made in the 1930s when the threat seemed distant and the budget seemed tight. They did it because men like Reginald Mitchell understood that the solution to a problem in fighter design lay not in copying what others had done, but in thinking more clearly about the fundamental principles of aerodynamics. They did it because the British RAF was willing to learn from experience and adapt its tactics, rather than rigidly adhering to doctrinal purity. The terror that German pilots felt in the presence of British fighters was not irrational. It was not propaganda or exaggeration. It was based on the hard experience of combat, on the realization that their training and tactics needed fundamental revision, and on the knowledge that the enemy air force over their heads represented not merely military opposition, but something more profoundly existential. The Spitfire had become a symbol of their vulnerability, a visible and audible reminder that the certainty they had felt in 1940 was no longer available to them. Every time a Spitfire appeared in the skies over the Channel, it carried with it the message that the Luftwaffe's dominance was not inevitable, that British determination and innovation could prove stronger than German numbers and doctrine. By 1944, when the final phases of the air war were being fought, the Spitfire had evolved almost beyond recognition from its 1940 incarnation. The Mark XIV variant could outperform the Bf-109K in almost every measure. it could reach 454 miles per hour in level flight. Its rate of climb exceeded 4,500 feet per minute. It could turn with almost anything the Germans could produce. And it would do this whilst carrying heavier armaments and better protection for its pilot than its predecessors. The German pilots who faced these later marks knew that they were flying against aircraft that had been continuously improved, whilst their own Bf-109 remained fundamentally similar to the 1939 original. The Luftwaffe had squandered years in which they might have undertaken fundamental redesign. They had instead opted for incremental improvements, each marginally better than the last, but never fundamentally addressing the design philosophy that had become, by the mid-war period, distinctly obsolete. The story of why German pilots feared British fighters is ultimately the story of why vision, innovation, and the willingness to question established doctrine can overcome apparent disadvantages. It is the story of a small nation producing technology that matched and then exceeded that of a larger, more powerful enemy. It is the story of aircraft that became, in the hands of capable pilots, weapons that determined the course of history. And it is a story that endures today, not as nationalist mythology, but as a testament to the principle that human ingenuity, applied with rigor and purpose, can achieve extraordinary things. The Spitfire terrified German pilots because it was not merely better, it was better by design, and in a contest between planning and improvisation, design and doctrine, innovation and tradition, the carefully considered approach ultimately prevailed. The roar of a Merlin engine, even now, more than 80 years later, carries within it the echo of that victory.